Heat lay thin over the narrow lane when the odd shape appeared beside the ditch, a brown body pressed small against the gravel as if the road itself had folded. It wasn't sleep. One ear lifted and fell, ribs moving in a shallow rhythm that kept time with dust. The dog watched without raising his head, then gathered himself and stood, careful on one foreleg that didn't want to hold him. He took 3 steps, stopped, looked back, and waited. The passerby slowed out of habit, meaning only to give room, but something in the dog's posture, tail low, then lifting as if testing a signal, asked for more than that. Hands open, voice low enough to be carried off by the wind, the man kept a respectful distance. "Easy, boy," he said, and the dog moved again, not fleeing and not begging, only checking that the space between them stayed steady. They set off together, dog ahead by a few yards, man behind with a steadying stride. They followed the line of broken macadam where it curved through scrub. The dog's hips were sharp, his coat dull, burrs clinging like small, stubborn stars. A faded groove at his neck showed where a collar had once sat. When a motorbike rattled past, he stepped off the road and lowered his head until the sound thinned into distance. Each time he resumed, he did it the same way, 10 paces forward, pause, a glance over his shoulder that held the man in place without pleading. The man matched him, shortening his stride when wind kicked grit across the lane and made the dog blink. There was no hurry, only the sense of being led to something that would not bear rushing. They left the road at a cut through the grass where old tires had pressed the earth flat, and a dry sweetness rose from a field not cleanly harvested. The dog kept to the hedge line, choosing strips of thinner shade beneath thorn and neem. He shook once, a quick roll of shoulders and neck that sent off dust like breath, then checked again that the man remained. It was not a look that asked for food or praise. It was the brief, working glance animals use when they must show something and need the other to keep up. In the far corner, a squat shed slumped into itself. Roof ribs showing through rust, doorframe empty of wood. There the dog's nose went to work. He pressed the gap under a loose board, inhaled, and lay down with his chin to the earth, letting out a sound too low to be a cry, but clear enough to call the man closer. The man crouched and did not reach in. At first he saw only darkness. Then the shadows tugged apart and resolved into small, breathing forms, mounds shifting together, paws splayed and twitching, ears not yet sure of their own weight. A litter lay in a pocket of dry ground under the shed floor, tucked where rain could not find them. They pressed close as if memory itself kept them warm. One nose rooted blindly and found nothing to nurse. The dog's ears flicked at that motion. His tail lifted, fell, lifted again. The man eased back a pace, scanning the field's edge for any shape that might carry milk or threat. No mother came. A faint current of warm air moved through grass and cooled the sweat at his neck. Water would have to come first. He poured a little into the lid of his tin and set it in the open, letting the dog see his hands retreat. The dog rose, limping, and drank with the economy learned from rationed days. 3 laps, pause, 2 more, then a lick to clear his nose. He left the last mouthful and looked at the gap again. The man tipped a second measure closer to the board. The dog did not touch it. He watched the hole as if his attention could hold its shape. And the man understood this was keeping vigil, not asking. He let his own hands be quiet and his voice even, marking presence without demand. The field held stilled heat that slowly unwound. A coal called from the fence and laid a thin ribbon of sound across the hour. The dog stood, turned a small circle and set his body between opening and open ground as if shadow could be a wall. The man pulled a folded sack from his bag and shook out its stiffness. He laid it near the board to soften wind where it met earth. The dog moved to a tangle of plastic and reed caught in wire, nosed it free, and carried back a fragment of cloth that smelled of dirt and rain. He nudged its edge into the gap with careful taps of his paw, working until the cloth lay where air would turn softer. The man added nothing then. He let the dog finish what he had begun. Only after the small work was done did the man walk the few minutes to the bend, fetch a pot of warm water, a little food softened to paste, and a blanket with the tired smell of soap, and return the same way. He kept every motion unhurried, placing bowl and cloth where the dog could reach without turning his back on the hole. The dog ate slowly, chewing as if his mouth remembered harder food and had to relearn gentleness. Between bites he listened to the sounds under the board, the brief squeaks and sudden silences that mark tiny lives, and then resumed, leaving a last bit for whatever the night might bring. The blanket's edge he dipped in warm water and pinned across the draught, a soft curtain that admitted air but not wind. He did not reach into the nest, the small space remained theirs. Evening drew itself thin. A moth tapped wood in a pale oval near the doorway. Crickets began a seam of sound that stitched the field from one hedge to the other. The man sat on the earth with his shoulder to a post. The dog settled along the sack's edge, so warmth could travel, but privacy could remain. He sighed once, a deep, careful sound, and stilled. If anyone had walked the lane then, they would have seen only a broken shed, a thin dog, and a man resting. Yet the lane had become a corridor between need and answer. The dog had chosen a stranger, and the stranger had understood the choice. The man knew more work would come with morning. Clean cloths, milk for mouths too small for bowls, hands practiced enough to move bodies without frightening them. But the night's task was steadier and simpler. He kept the bowl filled without clatter, moved the curtain to block a new thread of air, and watched for signs of pain that asked for more than patience. A tremor in the leg, a shiver not born of breeze, a breath caught too long. None came. Once, without planning it, he said, "I'm here." The dog's ear turned, held, then returned to the gap. Under the board, the small bodies slept in a shared warmth, no louder than grass. Field mice rustled in dry stems. A late truck murmured on the far road and left a faint line of diesel in the dark. When the hour cooled at last, the dog let his head rest fully on the sack and closed his eyes without forcing them open again. After a long quiet, he studied the limp from where he sat, tracing the gait in memory rather than hand. When the dog woke and shifted, the man slid his palm across the blanket and offered it, still and low. The nose touched him and moved on. A moment later the shoulder came close enough that skin met skin. The contact lasted the length of a breath. He felt heat and the fine tremor that rides tired muscles, but no sharp flinch that would speak of a break. He let the space widen again, and the dog accepted the return to distance as if this, too, were part of the work. To keep the ground kinder, the man dragged a few narrow boards from the pallet stack and laid them like ribs beside the opening, then slid the sack across them so damp would not come up as the night cooled. When wind pushed from the far side, he shifted the blanket to meet it. Once a pup stirred close to the light and gave a thin, seeking chirp. The dog's head lifted and his body leaned until his breath reached the hole, warm and steady. The small sound eased. Some things could be changed by tools and hands. Others required only patience until the right hour arrived. The man chose patience and set his back against the post, learning the small map of sounds that meant all was, for the moment, enough. Dawn would come later with its harder choices. For now, on a quiet strip of lane and field, a thin dog had guided a stranger to the small centre of his purpose and asked nothing more than presence. The man felt the earth cool under his palms and knew he would be here when light found them, at the edge of the board, keeping the night open so day could enter without startling anyone awake. The collapsed shed leaned as though it had been waiting years for this moment, boards softened by rain, roof ribs bent, one corner dropped so low the earth had pulled it into itself. The dog reached it first, limping in with his muzzle pressed low, circling once, as if to be sure of silence. Then he lay down at the edge of the shadow and nosed the space beneath a sagging plank. His ribs stretched sharp beneath his skin, his flank moving with each shallow breath, but his posture held steady, guarding, not resting. The man crouched behind him. A warmth rose from under the wood, a thick smell of soil mixed with damp straw, and the faint, sour trace of milk gone thin. When his eyes adjusted, he saw them. 5 small shapes pressed together in the hollow, their bodies no larger than curled fists, their fur patchy but already coloured with the promise of coats. They moved with the uneven rhythm of new life, each breath an effort. Each twitch a reminder that the world outside was too large for them still. Their eyes stayed closed. One shifted onto its back and gave a sound like a squeak trapped in cloth. The others pressed closer, the dog's ears tilted backward, his nose almost touching the wood, as if the plank itself were a barrier he must keep between strangers and the fragile cluster inside. His tail moved once, half a lift, half a fall, and then stilled again. The man spoke softly, a breath more than a sentence. "It's all right." He didn't move his hands forward. Instead, he set the tin bowl he carried to the side, letting the scent of water work its way into the dry air. At first, the dog ignored it. His eyes stayed fixed on the hollow, and his chest tightened each time one of the pups gave a sound. Only after long minutes did he shift his weight and lean toward the bowl. He drank in careful laps, pausing between each, as though measuring how much he could take without neglecting the nest. When he finished, he returned to his post. The man unfolded a scrap of cloth from his bag, an old blanket, frayed at its edges, washed enough times that the fibers carried no harsh scent. He didn't reach under the board. Instead, he spread it on the earth just at the entrance, tucking the corner so the wind could not lift it away. The cloth would not touch them, but its presence softened the ground near the gap, a small buffer between chill air and the warmth pressed into the soil. The dog sniffed at it, eyes narrowing for a moment, then lowered his head in what looked like acceptance. Inside, the pups shifted again. One stretched its foreleg, paw pads pale and soft, then fell back into the tangle. Another rooted against its sibling's belly, finding nothing but warmth. Their breathing stayed shallow, a chorus of small sounds that filled the hollow with a fragile music. Every so often, a tiny chest hitched with effort, then steadied. The man poured a little more water into the bowl, then sat back on his heels, making himself part of the stillness. He watched how the dog's muscles held tension at the shoulder, how his flank trembled when he adjusted his weight. Hunger had pared him down, but it hadn't taken his purpose. His eyes stayed on the hollow, unblinking, as though he could lend his strength to them simply by refusing to look away. When the wind shifted, the man lifted the edge of the blanket and pinned it with a stone, blocking the draft. The dog's gaze flicked toward the movement, then settled again. Trust didn't come quickly, but it flickered in these small surrenders, the shared water, the accepted cloth, the stillness, side by side. The shed creaked once in the quiet, a long groan of wood giving slightly under its own weight. Dust fell from the plank, scattering over the pups' backs. The dog gave a low whine, stood, and pressed his nose under to nudge them closer together, tucking them tighter into the pocket. They responded with soft rustles, their bodies moulding again into a single cluster. The man stayed still, knowing this was a task only he could perform. As the sun tilted lower, the air cooled. The field outside whispered with the sound of grass folding under breeze. Crickets began their evening chorus. The man felt the weight of the day settle, but he did not move to leave. He let the hours pass with the dog at his side, both of them keeping watch over the small, breathing nest under the broken floor. By the time the sky had deepened, the pups slept in their warmth. The dog's head rested lightly on his paws, and the man knew this moment was not chance. It was an invitation, fragile, temporary, but certain. The dog had brought him here to guard what he could not keep safe alone. And under that sagging plank, in the scent of earth and wood, life waited quietly for its chance to grow. By the time dusk softened the field, the dog had slipped away twice and returned each time with something held gently in his mouth. He laid a torn piece of flatbread by the gap under the plank, nudged it once to make it stay, and stepped aside. Later he came back with a weathered sliver of bone, set it next to the bread, and looked into the darkness where the tiny breaths gathered. His ribs showed clearly, but he did not eat. He waited, eyes fixed on the hollow, tail low, then still. The man knelt a little distance from the hole and let the scene explain itself. This was not a beggar's offering, it was a father's habit. He slid the blanket closer to the opening to turn the draught, broke the bread into small pieces, and dripped warm water over them so they softened without crumbling. He kept his hands broad and unhurried, never reaching past the plank, letting scent and temperature do what touch could not. Inside, the clustered bodies shifted and fell quiet again. The man prepared a narrow strip of clean cloth, twisted into a wick, soaked it in warm milk and water, and held it near the nearest mouth without crossing the line of shadow. The pup nosed blindly, caught the damp, and drew a thin thread of nourishment with slow, uncertain pulses of jaw. Another stirred, then another. He paused often, waited when a small body tired, and offered again when breath steadied. The dog watched every motion, shoulders taut at first, then loosening by degrees as nothing startled and nothing forced. When the wind changed and slid along the floorboards, the dog rose and placed himself on the windward side, a living wall that took the chill and returned warmth. A moth beat once against the loose tin. Cricket started stitching the grass with sound. The man wrapped a small bottle in cloth, filled it with warm water, and slid it near enough to lift the air in the hollow by a quiet degree. The pups settled into that warmth, breaths evening into a softer rhythm that felt like safety. The dog blinked slowly and lowered his head. The man set a shallow lid with a smear of softened grain near the blanket's edge. The dog sniffed, ate with plain care, and left a fragment behind. He swallowed, licked his nose to clear dust, and looked at the hole again. Only after the bowl was removed did he lie down, forepaws on the blanket, chest close enough to share heat. The man said a single line that did not travel far. "Good boy." The word marked the circle they had drawn around this place. Night gathered in steady layers. The man tied the blanket's corner to a post with coir rope so a new seam of wind could not creep in. He set a flat stone on the other edge for weight. The dog pressed his nose to these small changes, approved their scent, and resumed his post. When dust dropped from the plank and landed on a tiny back, he breathed lightly until the pup stilled. When two reached for the cloth at once, the man waited. Patience did the sorting. Near midnight, the dog made one more loop along the hedge and returned with a crust packed with road grit. He laid it by the door as if stocking a shelf, then accepted a cleaner portion from the man and water fresh enough to steam a little in the cool. When he finished, he rested his chin on his paws and watched the darkness under the floor, as if counting breaths. The man listened too, learning the map of sounds that meant enough, the hush of sleeping, the brief huff, the tiny swallow. Dawn did not bring a new plan, only the next turn of the same care. The cloth warmed and cooled in cycles. Mouths found it and released it. The bedding was lifted at the edges and shaken free of grit without exposing the nest to the larger air. The dog stood when the man stood and lay when he lay, saving movement for the moments when it mattered. When the man left to fetch supplies, he returned by the same path. Each time the dog's body loosened as the familiar footfalls approached. During the heat hours, the blanket threw a block of shade that kept the entrance dim. The man dampened its lower hem so evaporation cooled the air. He pressed the wrapped bottle deeper into the earth so it would not roll. The dog dragged a piece of cardboard to the doorway and made it a place to lie. He watched the lane without staring and dozed in small, ready fractions of sleep. When a step sounded close, he rose and placed his body in the gap until the sound faded. Evenings repeated themselves without ceremony. The dog gathered what the world left unclaimed, ends of bread, the corner of a paper that smelled of food, and set these near the door before accepting what was offered. He never begged. He ate with a grateful economy and returned to watching. The man recognized the meaning in these rituals. The offerings were not payment, they were the dog's way of staying inside the work, giving to the nest he guarded. On the second night, the man brought a low crate with padded edges and set it a short reach from the hole. A future step when small legs could push and eyes could open. He did not move the pups. He let the crate take the room's scent. The dog inspected the weave, tapped the padding once with his paw, and lay with his back against it so his warmth reached both the old place and the new. Small signs marked the next days: heavier sleeping, rounder bellies, fewer shivers after feeding. They spoke only when a sound asked to be answered. Once a sudden rattle from the distant road struck the siding and a pup cried sharply. The man adjusted the blanket to soften the light and said, "It's okay." The dog's ear turned toward him and then forward again, spare and sufficient. The rest was the clink of tin settled quietly, the whisper of cloth, the many small hushes that make a day safe. Even the shed learned them and creaked at predictable hours before falling still. By week's end, the routine held like a trail worn by careful feet. The dog no longer rose at every rustle, he chose his alarms. The man slept in brief turns on the crate, waking at small changes in breath. Together they fed, warmed, shielded, and waited. The hollow under the broken floor, once only a hiding place, became the calm center of each hour. It did not announce itself, it did not need to. It was enough that life inside was counted and kept. On a cool night, near the end of those first days, after the last check of rope and cloth, the dog shifted forward and touched each tiny back with his nose. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a light, deliberate tap for each. The man watched from the crate and understood the exchange without ceremony. What had begun as a rescue had become a shared duty. They kept the room in place together, breath by breath, while the field settled outside and the stars gathered above the rusted roof. When the time finally came to lift the nest, the air had turned gentle with late morning light, the kind that softened every edge of the broken shed. Days of patient care had given the pups a rounder shape, their bellies full enough to rise and fall with steady rhythm. The man knelt and eased the sagging plank upward, careful not to jar the pocket of earth beneath. The dog paced at his side, circling tight, tail twitching low, a sound like a breath caught halfway rising in his throat. The hollow was revealed in full, 5 small bodies pressed into the outline of their shelter, paws overlapping, ears folded, muzzles glistening faintly with moisture. The man gathered them one by one with a soft cloth, cupping warmth into his palms before settling each into the lined crate he had prepared. They shifted faintly, whimpering now and then, their sounds brief and unfinished. The dog leaned close at every movement, nosing each pup as if to stamp his approval, then stepping back just enough to let the man continue. When the last of the 5 had been placed, the man smoothed the cloth and adjusted the bottle of warm water beneath, giving their new space a sense of continuity. He exhaled slowly, thinking the work complete, but the dog did not settle. Instead, he stood abruptly, turned once, and trotted into the collapsed corner where splintered boards and rusted tin had been heaped. He disappeared in a tangle of shadows, claws scraping against loose planks. The man froze, listening. The sounds were deliberate, the push of shoulders through tight space, the muffled grunt of effort, then silence. A moment later, the dog emerged again. His jaws held something small, wrapped in the fragile awkwardness of early life. Not a pup, the ears tapered sharper, the fur shorter and marked in faint tabby stripes. A kitten, eyes barely cracked open, trembling as though its bones still learned to hold weight. The dog carried it with infinite care, his gait careful despite the limp in his hind leg. He set the kitten at the crate's edge, then nudged gently until the tiny form slid against the cluster of pups. They stirred, adjusting without protest, pressing instinctively toward heat. The kitten nestled among them, its cry soft and high, answered only by the shifting of small bodies making room. The man's breath caught, though he did not speak. He understood then what all the scraps and the waiting had meant. The dog had guarded more than his own kind. He had gathered what the world had left behind and made them a family. Without pause, without confusion. The dog bent his head and touched his nose to each back. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and now 6. The kitten quivered under the contact, then stilled. The shed seemed to exhale. Light filtered through gaps in the roof, dust floating down like pale motes caught between breaths. The man sat back, giving space to what unfolded without his interference. He could only record it with his eyes, the unlikely shape of trust and the larger nest the dog had chosen to make. The pups did not resist the intruder among them, their warmth spread evenly, their shallow squeaks muffled into a quiet chorus that now included a higher, sharper note. The kitten rooted clumsily against the flank of one pup, then burrowed into the curve of another's belly. Finding the same safety it would have sought anywhere, life beat steady. The dog watched, head tilted, body quivering faintly as if bracing for refusal. But none came, only the shared rhythm of 6 small chests rising in close, unbroken time. The man slid the crate closer to the blanket and pulled the edge higher against the breeze. He dipped the cloth wick again, let the milk seep, and held it near. This time, when the kitten's small mouth found it, the dog did not flinch. He stood directly over, nose nearly touching, ears flicking at every swallow. When the kitten released its hold and sagged into sleep, the dog exhaled through his nose in what could only be read as relief. Afternoon passed in slow increments. The dog rarely left the crate's side now. He shifted to block sun when it crept too far, lay with his chest pressed to the outer wall so his heat could seep inward. The man refreshed the water and food, adjusted the bottle under the cloth and moved only when needed. Most of the time he simply shared the quiet, a rhythm of breaths, the scratch of small claws against fabric, the softest hum of new life knitting itself together. As evening lowered, crickets filled the hedgerow with sound. The dog lifted his head, scanning the lane, but when no one came, he lowered it again, resting his muzzle on the crate. His eyes half closed, but he did not drift entirely into sleep. His body hummed with vigilance, a thread of tension never fully released. The man leaned back against the shed's post, legs stretched, content to keep the vigil beside him. When the stars came, faint against a sky still carrying heat, the dog made his ritual rounds, nose to each tiny back, light taps to confirm presence. He lingered a moment longer at the kitten, touching twice as though anchoring its place. Then he curled himself along the crate, his ribs against wood, his breath steady enough to be felt through the boards. Inside, 6 small lives pressed into one another, the faint chorus of their breathing lifted into the night. The man let the quiet hold. He did not break it with words. He simply watched as a father without kinship drew the line of family wider, insisting that what was left alone would not remain so. And under the broken roof, on a blanket pinned against wind, that insistence held 6 small bodies sleeping, 1 stray standing guard, and a silence that said more than sound ever could. First light came softly, stretching across the field in pale threads of gold. Dew clung to the weeds along the path, and the air carried that clean stillness that only mornings know. The man folded the blanket with care, wrapping each of the 5 pups and the 1 tiny kitten into a single bundle, their warmth gathered together. They whimpered faintly at the change of air, paws twitching in protest, but soon stilled against one another. The dog rose slowly from his place near the shed. His limp showed with each step, but he kept pace without hesitation, moving close at the man's side. His head stayed low, tail soft, ears tuned to every small cry muffled in the folds of cloth. He paused once to nudge the corner where a paw had slipped free, then fell back into stride, steady and silent. The path to the road was short, but it felt like a crossing between 2 worlds. Behind them lay the broken boards, the hollow earth, the days of waiting and watching. Ahead stretched the promise of shelter, food, and hands that would carry on the care. The dog did not look back. His eyes stayed forward, reading the way as if to be sure no harm would come. At the foster home, the door opened into warmth. Papers were laid out, pens tapped lightly on the wood of a desk, names and notes written into quiet order. The man signed where he was asked, his hand firm but unhurried. The dog stood near, shifting his weight from paw to paw, ears flicking at the sounds of the room. His gaze never left the bundle as it was set gently into a padded basket lined with fresh cloth. Bowls appeared, filled with water clear and cool, food softened for small mouths not yet ready for the hardness of the world. The pups stirred, their squeaks rising like faint questions, but the answers came quickly in warmth, milk, and touch. Even the kitten, smaller than the rest, pressed forward and found a place at the curve of soft cloth. Breathing settled into rhythm again, the sound of a room growing gentle. The dog circled once, then lowered himself near the basket, muzzle resting on its edge. He did not eat until the man guided him to the bowl, a hand steady on his shoulder. He drank, lapped at the food, then returned to his post. His eyes closed halfway, but his body remained alert, anchored to the small chorus of life beside him. Hours passed in the steady pulse of care. Visitors stepped softly, voices kept low. The man answered questions, gave what history he could, though there was little to tell. Most of it lived in silence, in gestures and trust that needed no words. Each time he looked at the dog, he felt the weight of that silence, as though the animal had carried the whole story in his ribs and left it to be read only by those willing to watch. When at last the work was done, when the basket had become a home and the papers were folded away, the man stood near the door. The dog remained close, head lifted once to meet his gaze, then lowering again as if the choice had already been made. The pups and the kitten slept, their breathing soft as threads of fabric shifting in air. The room held nothing but the hum of quiet life. The man stepped outside. Morning had widened, filling the lane with sun. He stood for a long moment with his hands loose at his sides, feeling the weight of what he had witnessed, the strange, simple insistence of care, the fatherhood of a stray who had chosen more than his own. The door closed behind him, soft on its hinges. The field lay still. The shed in the distance sagged into silence. A breeze moved through the grass, bending each stalk in turn. And as he walked away, he carried not just the memory of the bundle or the sound of tiny breaths, but the certainty that some stories end not in noise, but in quiet rooms, filled with the smallest of lives, breathing together in peace.